Alrighty, everyone, let's go ahead and dive in. Good afternoon. I am Natalie Ortiz from BrightHive. I'm joined by my colleague, Matt Stevens. You are here to hear us and listen to us talk about moving from data sharing to data collaboration. We're with BrightHive. Before I get into the substance of the presentation and our discussion, I want to just take care of a few housekeeping items. I know this session is being recorded. The organizers of Good Tech Fest, I believe, will be making it publicly available. We have access to chat features, so we'll try to answer your questions in terms of sort of relevance for what we're talking about. Otherwise, we'll save it towards the end. We also are monitoring the Slack channel for our session. And I think that will about cover it in terms of housekeeping. So just to tell you a little bit about BrightHive, we are the data collaborative company. Our mission is to see society's disconnected data be responsibly linked and purposefully used as a force for good that increases social equity and efficacy. We do this by working with networks of organizations to securely connect their data and create new data resources through data trust. BrightHive Data Trust is a legal, governance, and technical framework for data collaboration. And oftentimes in our past experience before we came to BrightHive, and even in the work that we're seeing now with clients before sort of we get involved, data sharing is one of these things. It's a legal agreement, or it's a technical solution like a data lake or a data warehouse. But rarely do we see governance as a part of that approach, and rarely do we see all three of these things sequenced appropriately. So we're going to be diving into the BrightHive Data Trust framework today. What we want to do today is dive into one way that we're seeing the COVID-19 pandemic drive a need for data sharing and a need for data trust, specifically in the area of workforce and the labor market. If you listen to our CEO's, Matt Gee's presentation talk yesterday as part of yesterday's keynote panel, you heard him mention that COVID is driving many needs that data trust can meet, including in childcare and contact tracing. Matt Stevens and I are just going to touch on workforce for now and highlight a use case that we're seeing in that domain. And then we'll dive into the nature of the problem around data sharing to begin with, and why it's just been such a challenge for so many for so long, and how data trust through data collaboration overcomes so many of those challenges. We also shared out in the Slack channel, for those that were able to join, some questions around your experiences with data sharing, and so we want to allow some time for your share outs on your efforts, whether they're past or current. And then we want to dive into how BrightHive Data Trusts are developed using the legal, governance, and technical framework. And we'll even do some highlighting of how existing data trusts have been able to pivot so quickly to responding to COVID-19 because of the mechanisms that are in place that allowed the quick turning on of data. And then I think we'll wrap up by just really highlighting what we've learned in doing data trust development. But you'll probably hear those themes, I think, throughout our presentation today. Like many presentations I'm sure you've heard or seen as part of Good Tech Fest, COVID is forcing some really hard conversations driven by the uncertainty that it's created. We see that when it comes to the economic impacts of COVID-19 and what the future looks like. 30 million people have filed for unemployment. Industries are evolving rapidly. Jobs in demand are changing, but it leaves a lot of questions for a lot of people. Where do people land when this is over? And these are questions that can be addressed empirically on some dimension, but the data that we need to answer the questions, who has the data that's needed to answer the question, the number of people unemployed is one thing, the number or what the skills of the unemployed are and how do we match them to the jobs that are available currently, the jobs that will be available post-pandemic is a completely different question. And that's a question or a use case that data trusts are positioned to address. When data are disconnected, people are left with more questions than answers, and no direction for how to answer their questions. These are quality of life questions. This is what keeps people up at night. This is what gives people hope for their future. I used to be in a job doing some work around health, human services, and justice data integration. And when the work got really tough, I had a boss tell me, you know, we're not curing cancer. And you're right, we're not curing cancer, but these are quality of life things that we're doing and problems that we're trying to solve, and they're important. And you know, there's no less of an impact of this work than some of the other work that people are doing. On the policy side, disconnected data means not knowing how to pivot resources to keep pace with changes, not knowing how to best coordinate different initiatives, and of course that just leads to bad decision making, bad investment, poor outcomes. Disconnected data carries consequences. It's a lot of work to piece information together. As an example, you know, I can go out and I can find a certified nursing assistant CNA program at a local community college. And I can Google the salary range of a person with a CNA job title. But I'm making an assumption that the CNA program that I'm looking at my community college is going to result in that salary for me. That CNA program could have never placed anyone in a job. But this isn't impossible data to link. It's not impossible to know what the return on investment is of a training program, of a very specific training program. It just requires the linking of the data. And of course, there's huge potential for inequality to manifest as a result of disconnected data. It depends on, you know, an individual's savviness around, you know, navigating, you know, the internet, for example, on information that might be available. For case managers, knowing that a service is provided by this local, you know, community-based organization, or this is a service that can be provided through a state agency, and that there's funding available to individuals who meet this criteria. So it just can result in huge just huge differences and impacts across different types of people.
And workforce
so
agency,
this means that,
oh, sorry, my bad. Go for it, Natalie.
I was just going to say that, so, you know, we see that, you know, as agencies are trying, or states or different organizations are trying to answer these questions, that they're actually diving into what solutions look like. And so, Matt, I just wanted to turn it over to you to let you talk about that.
Yeah, of course. Sorry for that false start there. So workforce agencies, they need labor market supply and demand data, and they need it combined and displayed in ways that are going to enable them to face the COVID-19 economic crisis head on. And they need access to this data now. But, you know, and they need access, right, to information like, you know, what and where are those available jobs, and they can get that from job posting data. They want to understand, you know, who's experiencing job loss, where are these job losses geographically, but also in terms of different sectors. And for people who've lost their job and have a certain set of skills, what skills do they need to gain to be able to get new jobs, and what training programs are available in their area that meet kind of their needs to help reskill them for those new jobs. And so those are really, you know, like I said before, the workforce agencies, they need access to this data now, but they need the data sharing set up in such a way that they not only get access to the data now at a point in time, but that the data is going to stay up to date. Because I think, you know, as Natalie's pointed out, you know, in the wake of the COVID-19 crisis, we're going to see a lot of rapid changes that workforce agencies are really going to need to be studying. You know, in the past, for those of you all who saw our presentation at Good Tech Fest last year, you know, we were talking about, you know, why can't data about jobs be available online the same way data about making a decision about a hamburger is available? And we're just in a different place than that, right? We're not in a place of just help me find this fixed point in time. With the new kind of emerging economy, it's a moving target. And so, whereas we might have thought about career pathways in the past as this kind of finite thing that we can help people find kind of the starting point towards a good job. It's a moving target now. And so we need data sharing set up in a way that reflects this. You know, going forward, we're going to want to know what jobs went away, but are coming back as the economies reopen, and what jobs aren't coming back, and which new jobs are emerging, and which of these are being filled or unfilled in a specific region. And, you know, I mentioned this before, but those new jobs that are coming back, what, for people who've lost their job, you know, what similar jobs can they reskill for, and how can they really quantify those skills and understand how they get that retraining? But then from the other perspective, you know, for training providers, what skills are not currently being taught in an area to meet the needs of those new jobs, and how can they update their curriculums to accommodate this?
And so we actually see, this is actually something that we see our current clients asking for is, you know, if you are able to take the job data and take the training provider data and, you know, take the profile of UI claimants, you know, what can we do with that data to understand who is out of a job? What are the skill profiles? What are their education levels? Where do they live? Where were they working? And then what is available to them now? What are the jobs available now? Are they close to them? Are they, you know, carrying a wage, or you know, can they make a similar amount of money? Is it matching skill sets that they have? And so these are actually, you know, these are the questions that we're getting from current customers. These are the questions that we're getting from prospective customers. But all of this to say is that this data can be linked. This data can be brought together in a way that helps inform those that are trying to work with people who are out of jobs right now and who are trying to get people back to work quickly, and trying to understand where to invest resources. So, you know, as we were thinking about all of those questions that people have, we can start to piece the data that we have available now to help people get answers to those questions.
And so at a high level, you know, the data sets that need to be joined to answer these questions, you know, it seems pretty simple, right? It's jobs data, and being able to understand what jobs are available and what are being filled and not filled, but being able to match the jobs to the skills necessary to complete those jobs. And then being able to match skills to training programs about what skills do different curriculums offer. And then based on that, what trainings would an individual with some skills need to be able to get another job? So at a high level, that seems really simple. But for anyone who's tried to share data before, you know, we know that it's really challenging. But why was data disconnected in the first place, pre-COVID? And why historically has it been so hard to connect it, even in easier times? So I really want to, you know, kind of jump into the weeds a little bit here. You know, in a former life, I was a data analyst in a nonprofit organization, and a lot of my day-to-day work was, you know, receiving CSV files from different partners and trying to join them together. And so, you know, for those of us in the room who've had that experience or can kind of picture what that's like, let's think through what would a traditional bilateral data sharing look like between three parties. And going through this exercise, we can understand why it may break down. And it may be easy, or not easy, but doable to kind of get a data sharing agreement in place, an agreement on what fields are needed, on what timing, on how you're going to transmit the data. But what does it look like going forward, and how easy is it to make adjustments? So in order to get bilateral data sharing between three parties going in the first place, you really need three things. First, you need alignment around a bunch of different factors. You know, the obvious one is data standards, right? What's the data going to be structured like? What kind of skills ontology are you going to use to map jobs and training? What goals do the three organizations coming to the table have in common that, you know, motivates them to come and want to share data in the first place? It may be really easy for the three parties to align on goals initially, but, you know, as a project develops and new opportunities reveal themselves to add additional fields, or for the data partnership to grow, those goals can shift a little bit. And it's really hard amongst multiple parties to keep those aligned. There can be different privacy restrictions for different entities. Schools have different privacy restrictions than something as open data as kind of job listings. And so the more parties you get to the table, the more different privacy restrictions are at play, and it makes it really challenging to find an alignment that meets everybody's needs while allowing you to meet those goals. And finally, when you're combining these data sets, how do you define data ownership of what gets created? Everyone contributes a piece of their own data, but who ultimately gets to make decisions around what gets created going forward? The second aspect is timing. Something just as simple as like, what order are you going to join the data and who's joining the data? I think when we're talking about like jobs and training and skills, those are pretty, not sensitive data sets. And so ultimately you could send those to one person and they could join them, and it's not too complicated. But if you think about other use cases where maybe you have individual level data and you're matching, student like training participation data with wage outcomes, what order are you going to join the data? And by the time you move from, party A sharing data with party B, and they've joined that and shared it with party C, how does that initial party stay in the loop about what happens to their data later on and what decisions are being made? It gets really tricky, and it's hard to maintain that alignment and consensus that you established in the first place. And finally, it's just an issue of capacity, right? People may be motivated with shared goals to come to the table and work this out once, but who has the time to keep this running going forward, to manage it, to oversee that the goals of the project are still being met, and to take on the risk if sensitive data is being shared, much less to be able to monitor it and to start to propose improvements and kind of start this process all over again. So zooming out a little bit, that's the kind of the on-the-ground example of setting up a data sharing agreement between three parties and why it might be challenging. But it kind of zoomed out, there's some larger trends, and I touched on these a little bit already, so I may move kind of quickly through this. But there are institutional and legal constraints that really are going to prevent consensus over time when multiple parties come together. There may be legal constraints that prohibit one organization from moving too far towards consensus, and the same thing with organization B. And so consensus may just be too challenging based on these constraints. As I mentioned, bilateral data sharing agreements are really fragile. If you think about what a data sharing agreement usually looks like, it's a legal agreement that specifically says what data is going to be shared, what fields, who's going to access it, how often is it going to be updated, and then it's signed and executed. And if you discover that, oh, there's an additional field that would be really useful, or we asked for address and just assumed that zip code would be included, but sure enough, no, zip code was not included. To make that addition, oftentimes you have to modify the data sharing agreement and get it re-signed. And often it has to go go through the legal review process, and just takes up a lot of time. And then, as I already mentioned, organizations already have limited capacities, especially in their data shops. And so oftentimes parties don't even come to the table just because they know they already don't have time to do the things that they're looking at on a daily basis. Often there are top-down mandates within organizations. Leadership may think a project is really cool, but by the time the data analyst gets pulled to the table and the realization of how much time it's going to take and some of the challenges at hand, it kind of sets these data sharing initiatives off on the wrong foot. And then finally, there's variation in organizational data and technology, ways that the data is being stored, systems that are being used. It's not necessarily that the cloud is better than an on-premise server. It's just that when, every technology has its strengths and its weaknesses, but trying to align across these different organizations makes it really hard to align and integrate these data sharing initiatives. But data sharing, it isn't just a workforce sector problem. As Natalie mentioned before, we shared out in the Slack channel for this session a few of these questions yesterday, and hope that some of you all in attendance had a chance to kind of think these through. But even if you didn't see those ahead of time, if there's anybody who'd be willing to share a little bit about an experience you've had at an organization, either in the past or currently, when you've tried to share data, what happened? If
I
anybody
think I
wants-
might have to, I was going to say, I think I might have to unmute people. So let me just try to figure this out really quickly on how to do this.
Yeah. I think also within the participants window, there is the ability to raise your hand. And I think that could be, in the meantime, an easy way, or to put something in the chat if you'd be willing to. Oh, looks like we've got Jim Daniel.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, I tried doing lots of very complicated programmatic data sharing across all of Oxfam. I was at Oxfam America, and then that failed. And so we went back and we just tried to compare fairly straightforward financial data across all of Oxfam. And it took us, surprisingly, it took us almost 3 years to get the apples to apples comparisons around things like definition of employee versus volunteer versus, different categories of spending before we could actually start to get meaningful comparisons and aggregate data. And even when we were all done after 5 years worth of work, there were still quite a few examples where the data was imprecise or incomplete. But it took us a long time to eventually get used to having the data, even if it was only 80 or 90% right. And it was really disappointing that once we had the data, we didn't actually use it for decision making. So we received the data into a common group, we analyzed it, we scrubbed it, we normalized it, we did all this other stuff, and then we'd promptly ignore the data and make a decision based on either the funding or political pressures of the moment. Back to you.
Yeah, I think we see these patterns happen all the time, but committable to stay with it and get those things in place. But it is frustrating when all that effort happens and then being able to use that data in a meaningful way on top of that is really challenging. We've got a couple more coming through in the chat.
This is Jim, one last comment. I'll throw it out. How many of you are actually publishing into IATI and have been able to use the IATI data in any meaningful way? That's an interesting question back.
What is the IATI?
It's the International Accountability Transparency Initiative. It requires all organizations that are providing funding to projects in certain countries to use a standard form and publish what is the project, how much was funded, so all the inputs and all the activities. And the original standard stopped there, but eventually it's being extended now for outputs and outcomes. But it's a global IATI database. It's a global transparency initiative for international NGOs. But it has not really, even though it's been around now for quite a few years and a huge amount of effort invested into it, it's been very hard to use the IATI database to get information back out in a way that would be for apples to apples comparison on program. Back to you.
Thank you. I think we have Christina Bass.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, so in my previous role, I worked for a Catholic healthcare system and their community benefit office, which was a community-facing group. And they were awarded a Community Health Innovation Region grant for the state of Michigan that was built around creating this huge social network infrastructure for kind of the most fragile patients around how they access social services and healthcare and judicial services and education, and hit all these different organizations within the community. And so there was a huge, one of the big goals was to create a common data infrastructure. So there were 5 groups, 5 counties in Michigan that were trying to do this simultaneously over the course of 3 years. And the thing that we found to be most difficult when we were looking at sharing what we referred to as patient level data on these individuals was clinical health, behavioral health, especially substance use disorders, and then the educational realm all had very different, very explicit, very tight agenda rules on how that data could be shared, and whom it could be shared with, and for what purposes. And it, at one point, I think we had 5 lawyers that were involved, each representing a different realm or a different organization, making sure that this data wasn't going to be abused. And that was before we even found a place to house the data. So in the end, it ended up being housed in a data warehouse that was provided by a local healthcare system. And they were contributing data analytics time pro bono for the life of the grant. But that grant expired 6 months ago. As the project manager, I went on to another project with another organization, and all the data analytics infrastructure, with the exception of the warehouse storage space, was repealed as well. And so now there's 3 years worth of amazing community level data that's just sitting, and no one knows what to do with it. And all the people that had once been connected with the grant funded project are gone. So it was a valiant attempt, but it never really came to fruition, I think, in the way the state intended to. And it really was an excellent example that the difficulty in maintaining and doing this kind of data collection and doing something with it isn't in the initial collection, although that was really difficult legally, but it's in finding the human capital to maintain that.
Right, that's exactly right. I think that's a very insightful lesson. You know, the data challenges, there are solutions to. The legal challenges, there are human capital solutions to being able to stick with it. And I think what we'll talk about in the coming slides, as we talk a little bit about this data collaboration model, is how do you create a framework or a structure that allows people a kind of a playbook to work from, to work together to kind of answer some of these questions and make sure that all the questions are answered from the start, so that, you know, to try to, with the goal of trying to avoid situations like you just described, where people put in a lot of time and you know, the thing that gets built ends up being not you know, having the long-term impact that everybody hoped that it would. Thank you so much for sharing that. I think we have time for one more. Jade Beebe?
Yes, that's right. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. So my example is, so I work for a nonprofit in San Antonio, Texas, that is a collective impact organization. And what that means, I guess, just to quickly summarize, is that we're actually focused on youth and young people in San Antonio and Bexar County, and creating partnerships and connecting partners that serve youth to create more coordinated and remove barriers, to create more coordinated and easy to access pathways for success, whether that's through going to higher education or creating workforce opportunities. One of the ways that we do this is we do this by helping our partners, which could also be out of school time providers, understand their programs through data. So we do a lot of like data literacy education programs for actual nonprofits and other practitioners. For the purpose of data sharing though, we have about 10 right now data sharing agreements set up with 10 of the 15 ISDs or independent school districts in Bexar County and San Antonio. And I don't know how it works in other states, but from what I understand, Texas is kind of unique in the way that we structure our school districts. I guess in some states they don't have as many, and in some cities in Texas you can have as many as 15 to 30 depending on the size of the city. So San Antonio has 15, and each of those 15 do their own data processes completely different. They have different capacities for supporting data as well, and some of them have data departments that have people that don't have any experience in data. They just sort of somehow ended up there. And then our data sharing agreements are signed by the superintendents, so that messaging doesn't always get trickled down to the actual staff that is having to then send us data. And so we started doing one-on-one meetings with them when we executed MOU, but even then it still comes down to capacity, where they just don't, they can't send us the student level data that we're asking because they don't know how to pull it, or they just don't have the bandwidth to because of the minimum reporting requirements they have to do to the state. And to make things a little bit more complicated, we have to use the school district data to match with out of school time provider data that we get from them on the students that they're serving in out of school time sector for funders. So we're not a funder, but funders locally have asked us to help as kind of a third party evaluation organization. And so we create Tableau dashboards for them based on their data, but we have no way to enforce for them to send us their data, let alone the completeness or the consistency of the data we get. So every single time, like I'm supposed to be getting monthly data submissions from 15 or 10 ISDs and 30 different other community nonprofits. And it's kind of a nightmare to just wrangle all of them to do that. Let alone to have them send it consistently. So that's something that we're really struggling with, is trying to not only communicate that, because everyone's on board, you know, when you're in those meetings, they're like, yeah, we want to do this. And they're all in the collaborative sort of mindset, but the actual how to operationalize that in a way that's not creating more work for entities that are already strapped thin with resources as it is, and staff has just, it's really been a struggle. So we're trying to figure out ways to, you know, maybe make some more integrated operability sort of systems, but it's a challenge since there's so many independent operating sort of silos within a relatively small geographic footprint. So that's the most immediate and ongoing example that we have within our organization of how we've struggled with that sort of data sharing.
Yeah, well, thank you for sharing that. No, that's an example we hear quite a bit, because, and there were a few things you said there that I want to draw attention to, because we're going to talk a little bit about it in the coming slides. You know, I think one is, it's this balance between, you know, with data collaboration, you know, each organization, it has its own incentives for participating, and that's totally fine, right? Because you have your own needs and you have your own challenges. And then there are the overarching goals, shared goals that all the organizations have for coming together. But it's keeping that balance right and designing the project in a way, right, that allows you to balance the individual constraints with the shared goals. And what the data trust model that we're going to talk about really serves to create is that cadence for how this group gets together on a regular basis and agrees from the start for how they're going to work together. To make decisions about the data, to identify the right people, to determine how to shape not only what their organization's role is and contributing, but also what the group together seeks to build. So that's really what the data trust model is, and I'll talk a little bit about that now. You know, so what BrightHive does, as Natalie mentioned before, is that we empower networks of organizations to securely connect their data sources and to create new shared data resources. And the way that we do that is through this framework called the Data Trust, that is really a combination of a legal and ethical framework, a data governance process, which we'll talk a lot more about through some examples in the coming slides. And that data governance process really dictates, you know, how these organizations come together, what types of decisions are they making around the goals, the approved projects, the data sets that need to be created by the group to meet the goals, and then the approved uses and users of that data. So it's creating that cadence and that vision in the framework for that group to work together. And then what comes out of the governance process are some really clean technical requirements that allow, you know, regardless of what technology you're using, a roadmap for what needs to technically be built to allow that data to flow in a way that doesn't require analysts to have to necessarily pull files on a monthly basis. Can we set this up once and reuse the infrastructure? And we'll talk a little bit about what that looks like as we go forward. So it all starts with the legal agreement. And so, you know, we talked a lot about in that slide about with the three groups in traditional bilateral data sharing, moving from, you know, those traditional data sharing agreements that needed to be very, very specific about what data is being shared and the terms. I mean, data sharing agreements always need that level of specificity, but can we balance that specificity with flexibility to take on new projects, and agility to reuse data for new projects in a way that still meets those specific legal needs? So the data trust agreement, the legal agreement that really kicks off a data trust, it's more than just enumerating the data that needs to be shared. In fact, what it really focuses on in the body of this agreement is distinct clearly defined roles and governance routines that are designed with long-term collaboration in mind. So rather than saying, so if three organizations come to the table and say, we want to build a data trust, what's in that agreement isn't, we will share these data sets and these data fields at this basis. What's in that data trust agreement really just focuses on how that group is going to make decisions, the types of decisions they'll make, and outlines their commitment to following that process rather than to sharing data specifically. So as I mentioned, the body of that data trust agreement, it outlines the governance process for decision making, and that includes the process for expanding the data trust. We tend to take, I think another word that popped up in a couple of those examples that I heard, like huge and large and kind of all encompassing. And I think data trusts, the goal can be, we want this to be a large initiative. We want this to have large impact, but we tend to take the approach of what we call our minimum viable coalition. What are the minimum number of organizations and data sets that need to come together to solve an immediate goal? And so we really take that approach because, as in a lot of your examples, the more people who are at the table, the more lawyers who have to review the document, the more competing privacy needs. But it's easier if you start with a couple, get that alignment, get the process in place, and then you can bring on additional members in the process. And so that's part of what the data trust agreement outlines is what is that process for bringing on new users, new use cases, and things like that. So like I said, the body of that agreement, it's just the rules of engagement for that governance process. And then there are a series of exhibits in the back that are set up to capture the types of information that you might be used to seeing in a traditional data sharing agreement. Things like what data sets are going to be contributed by who? How can these data sets be used? What are the approved uses? Who are the approved users? But like I mentioned, these exhibits really, they're blank at the time that the data trust agreement is signed. And so as things are updated by the data governance board, it's really only exhibits to the signed agreement that are getting updated rather than the body of the agreement itself, which in most cases means that the modifications to what data is being shared don't require re-execution of that legal agreement.
And Matt, one thing I want to add about the DTA as well is it's template, right? So,
Yes.
It's better than starting from a blank page for a lot of organizations that are working together for the first time or working together in a new way for the first time. And so it's better than starting for a blank page from them, but it's highly adaptable and highly flexible to what it is that the organizations want. When they have their own internal organizational processes for reviewing it, what language do they want to take out? What language do they want to add? We go through a pretty intense reconciliation process to make sure that everybody that is every organization that's contributing data as part of that minimum viable coalition of the data trust, that they're providing it, that they've got eyes on it in their organization, that feedback, those edits are being brought up back to BrightHive. BrightHive is reconciling, and then we're taking it back to that minimum viable coalition where there are comments that are sort of outstanding, right? It involves some sort of decision making or some sort of compromise between two or more organizations because what they want is in conflict. And so what BrightHive does is facilitate that process to get to a final version of the DTA that everybody is happy with. Everybody knows sort of what they have asked for, where it lands, what decisions and what trade-offs had to be made in order to get to that final version. But it's a very, very collaborative approach to developing and then executing this data trust agreement.
And so because it's a template, and like Natalie said, it really can be customized to the needs of different partners. The end result is often structured differently to meet those needs. And so we just wanted to go over a few examples of what this looks like in practice, because to start with, it is just a legal agreement, but really what comes out of it is that governance process that really meets the needs of each specific data trust. And so with our Colorado Data Trust, they specifically built the data trust agreement and the governance board to run in parallel to an existing steering committee. They developed an application that required a steering committee that had partnership from multiple agencies across the state government. And so that group was already meeting to determine, what features should go into this application to meet the needs of Coloradans who want to make decisions about education and work. And so the Data Trust Governance Committee was built sort of in parallel. And so the same agencies were represented on the Data Trust Agreement, but the people who were represented were different, because you want to make sure that you have those data stewards who really understand the data, but also in the right positions, that they understand the goals of the organization, and that the goals of the Data Trust would fit both within the decisions of the My Colorado Journey Steering Committee, but then also had enough vision to be able to see what other data sharing initiatives are going on between these agencies that, while it may not align 100% with this application to start with, would lay the groundwork for some data sets that could be used later on by this application or just by other agencies.
Yeah, and the two examples that I wanted to share, jobs data in quotes, that should be a client's name, but I'm protecting their identity. This is two organizations that were already sharing data with one another. They had combined their data to generate a very robust data set on jobs. I mean, we're talking millions of jobs over more than a decade. And but their business arrangement and their legal arrangement didn't allow them to expand their use of that data. They, like I said, they have a very, very specific business arrangement. And so what they did is form a data trust that would allow them to expand beyond sort of the necessary day-to-day business obligations that they needed to meet, and allow them to make that data available to approved third-party researchers or to applications that could potentially be pulling in jobs data and making it available. So all that to say, like what Matt was saying, it's really working with the structures that are already in place and recognizing, that you can carve out different ways that the partnership needs to operate, allowing one sector, one component of it to operate in one way, sort of separate from the data trust, but complementing the data trust efforts. Similarly, what we're doing in Virginia with the Virginia CareerWorks referral portal and the Virginia Workforce Data Trust. The Data Trust Agreement is embedded in a multi-agency MOU. That MOU is mostly around data sharing or cost sharing and the equitable distribution of funding, the referral portal system that includes the data trust, that includes an application, that includes some analytic capabilities. So those costs are distributed across all of the agencies participating. But inside that MOU is the data trust agreement that is stipulating how are these data coming together, how are they being used, who are the users of the data, what are the roles and responsibilities of the governance board in determining how that data is used. And so there's, just multiple ways that we can make a data trust agreement work. There's also other cases where a data trust agreement is standing totally on its own. It's not embedded in anything else, but we wanted to mention these examples because I think it really highlights the flexibility of the arrangement.
And so once that data trust agreement is signed by that minimum viable coalition of organizations, those data trust members are going to form, the data trust governance board. And as we mentioned already, their job is really to manage and to monitor and to sustain the data trust, to address the current, but also to have a view on those future data collaboration challenges and opportunities. So it all starts, I think a lot of these organizations already have identified a shared goal prior to signing that data trust agreement. It's why they came to the table. But one of the first things that governance board does is formally votes to approve. This is the shared goal of the data trust to start with. It really serves as that North Star for all of the conversations going forward until the new goal or an additional goal is identified. And so they make those decisions about the use of the data trust resources through like regular monthly or quarterly convenings, depending on capacity. And it is their job to make sure that the data trust is developed and deployed as detailed in the data trust agreement. So they are both collaborating through conversation as the data experts, as the experts of the people that these organizations are trying to serve and their needs. They're both shaping the data collaboration, but then also once the technical part gets built, ensuring that what is built, aligns with the needs and the permissions of the data, of what was decided by the Data Trust Governance Board. And then they collaboratively identify and approve, new enhancements, expansions, and those guiding ethical principles.
So part of our work with data trusts, the people and the organizations that make up the data trust, is facilitating a bit, and sometimes quite a more than just a bit, of culture change and evolving the mindsets around data sharing, while recognizing and respecting where people are coming from and their concerns, their preferences, their internal processes, like I had mentioned before, helping them recognize their role in shaping the data trust. We talk about shared goals. We talk about, really coming to alignment and making sure that, people are owning this, they're investing it. It's not a top-down mandate. We want them to carve out a place in the data trust that works for them. I was in an earlier Good Tech Fest session on change management that relates so well to so much of the work that we do alongside our clients to establish the governance structure, the governance process to manage this different way of operating. So 6 things that we really focus on when we're developing data trust, as I think you've heard us use the word over and over and over again. Collaboration is one of our principles, along with transparency and sustainability. To the earlier comments around, we, coming together and then it sort of falls apart because funding isn't there. You at least have a mechanism in place that allows this, allows the organizations that are sharing data to remain connected to each other, to try to work together to find additional funding or to find opportunities to continue the work that has already been started. Another one of our principles is reliance on existing knowledge, partnerships, and relationships, really tapping into the fact that this probably isn't new to a lot of folks, of the challenges and sort of the struggles, also recognizing historical context around some of the hesitations with sharing data, really sort of, diving into that and wading in it and recognizing that, hey, this is an important thing to account for. The other thing that we at BrightHive are really working towards is the use of open source technology, particularly to mitigate against vendor lock-in. On our earlier slide about the data trust agreement, that's open source. You can go to the BrightHive GitHub and you can find the data trust agreement that, the template data trust agreement that we've developed, and we'll also share it in the Slack channel. Another one of our principles is the use of open data standards. This is to increase interoperability and maximize the ability of the data trust to contribute or link data to other initiatives using the same standards, very similar to what was mentioned earlier about the global effort, global data standard effort. Promoting equity of opportunity is another principle, going back to the point from the beginning around the consequences of disconnected data and how that can shape out for different people who have different profiles and what that means for their outcomes. Another one is alleviating administrative burden. Contribute data once. We see this in our Virginia work with coordinated referrals for services and eliminating as much as possible the duplication of data entry. You have one person that's coming in, they're providing that information, and it goes to four different agencies. So we're really trying to alleviate the administrative burden on folks to contribute data and to use data. And then finally, building capacity, that we want people who are equipped with the knowledge, including process knowledge, to champion the data trust when it comes to expanding the data trust to new use cases or to new data sets, that people feel empowered to do that and to understand what the data trust is, to understand the value that it's providing to their organization, the value that it's providing to the community, and really not just on the data side, but also on the privacy side, also on the ethics side, that people really are understanding and wrapping their arms around the value that the data trust brings to their community and to solving the problems that they're facing. Matt, do you want to cover this one?
Definitely. So we talked a lot on the past couple slides about data trust governance and the types of decisions that this data trust governance board makes, but I kind of want to zoom in a little bit and make it a little more interactive to think about, like, what does it really mean for a group of people to govern shared data? And so we're going to talk about kind of three main kind of benefits that come out of what this looks like, and also kind of talk through an example of what types of decisions would a data trust governance board make to address different problems. How would they make these decisions? What would be the process involved? But then what would also be the benefit? So really there's three things we're going to go over. One, this is the kind of the word of the session, but the governance process is collaborative, right? There's a conversation that human beings who know the data and know the challenges are having around aligned goals. It allows data to be reusable. So organizations can contribute their data one time, and then they can vote to accept new uses of that data and new users. And so there's no additional burden on the people, on your technical staff who need to contribute the data. Once it's mapped and understood where it lives and how it would get into the data trust, it's really just a governance issue of what would be those acceptable uses. And then finally, it's iterative. We take this land and expand approach. The initial use case really sets the foundation for the ways that the data trust can expand with new members, but also the ways that existing data assets can be kind of built upon. And so one thing that I didn't mention in the earlier slides, but that I really just want to make really clear here, the way that the data trust governance process works is really each data trust member wears two hats. On one hand, they're a data steward for their organization and the data that their organization is contributing. And as a data steward, they maintain complete ownership and control over how their contributed data is used. But then once that data gets combined with other contributed data from other organizations to create these kind of collaborative trust managed resources, it's those jointly owned, jointly governed resources that are truly governed by the governance board. So it's this balance between each person being an autonomous member and creating things that need this shared ownership and shared control. And just because you've contributed data once for one reason, and just because the Data Trust Governance Board approves an overarching use case, it doesn't mean that your data has to be used in that way. You always reserve the ability to maintain that control and say, well, I see why that would be useful overall, but I'm not sure that my stakeholders would be comfortable with the data being used in that way. And there's nothing punitive about doing that within this framework. So just to talk through what it means that a data trust governance is collaborative, and I think maybe this might already be clear, but the board comes together, right, with a shared goal. So let's say that the three agencies are at the table and they say that, well, the residents of our state should have clear, thorough, and accurate information that's needed to make decisions about training opportunities they might want to participate in. And so, let's say one of those entities is a higher education department. And so the data steward from the higher education department is going to identify and contribute the necessary data to the data trust. They're going to take the measures through that governance process that are needed to say that, hey, we have this ETPL training provider list data set that we consider to be like the true source of truth for training provider and program data within our state. And we're going to contribute it to the trust. Well, so now it's in the trust, and the trust is just kind of a place until the governance board identifies and approves a use of this data and approved users of this data. And so in this case, the governance board identifies a third-party application that people within the state are often using. And it would be really helpful if that application had access to this information. And so the governance board proposes this use and votes on it and approves it. And then an exhibit of the data trust agreement is updated to reflect this new use and this new user of the data. And the way that like I mentioned before, because it's just an exhibit that's being updated, not the body of the agreement, in this case, the data trust agreement does not need to be re-signed by the parties since they followed the rules that were outlined in that executed agreement. And once that happens, the data resource that's been contributed to the trust is made available to a third-party application via an API. And so that third-party application is provided credentials to that API. They're provided a unique key, and then they are able to read in and display that training program and provider data to residents of the state. But data trust governance also generates reusable data assets, as I mentioned before. And so let's say that data governance board, they've contributed that training party data, but suddenly, COVID-19 happens, right? And there's a new resource, a new third-party application that residents are using to try to find information about training opportunities. How can the same data set that's already been contributed once be granted access granted to this second third-party application? And so, because this new opportunity meets an existing goal that already had been approved by the governance board, that they think that their residents should have clear, thorough, and accurate information needed to make decisions, all that they need to do is at the next governance board meeting is identify and approve this new user and use of the data. Again, it gets reflected in the exhibit, so the agreement does not need to be re-signed. And once it's approved, the credentials to the API are extended to a second third-party application, and they are able to, as soon as they have those credentials, access that information and make it available through their application to residents. So what you can see, it's reusable because the data existed, nothing had to change or be rebuilt. It's just a new approved party was granted access, and it was reflected in the agreement to govern and track who has access to the information. And so the third benefit is that data trust governance enables iterative expansion. In the examples that we talked about already, just to kind of map it, you had existing data in the data trust where the higher education department provided training provider and program data to the data trust. And then on the right side, you can see that this information was made available to that third-party application 1 and third-party application 2. But what if there's an entirely different use case? In this instance, and I'll talk a little bit about the process next, the same state agency has to provide WIO reporting data to the Department of Labor on an annual basis. And historically, they would need to use training provider data, training program data, training participants data, and UI wage data to be able to take individual level data, match it against UI wages that they have access to, and then aggregate this information by the different training programs that participants went through. And then submit this aggregated program level data on kind of 2 and 4 quarter wage outcomes to the Department of Labor. So that's what they want to be able to do through the data trust, since they recognize, hey, we've already got 2 out of these 4 data sets in the data trust. What would they need to do through the governance process to make this a reality? And so first, they need to identify a new shared goal. And that, because it's not covered by the existing goal of just making information available to people in the state. They want to reduce administrative burden of federal reporting requirements. And so they identify and approve, I'm sorry, I didn't update this part of the slide, but they want to, what that should say is identify and approve this new shared goal. And again, the executed data trust agreement is updated. We would also need to approve the Department of Labor as a user of this data set. And so that would also be voted on and reflected in the exhibits. And once that happens, there's permission to be able to share this data onward. So then, once you have that data in there and you're able to calculate those very specific WIO reporting outcomes, you can start to think about, well, what other things the data trust could think about, what other things can we do with this data? And can we make sure that these uses, map to one of our goals? And so they may say, hey, there's very specific reasons why training participant and UI wage data is mandated to be shared for these WEO reporting purposes. And 2 and 4 quarter wage outcomes are really useful information, but we have some additional measures of return on investment that we want to be able to calculate on our training programs. And we need the same data to do this. We just might have different metrics we want to calculate, and we may want to share those metrics with different people. So for instance, there's that third-party application number 1, where we're already providing information about which training programs are available. But it would be really great if there was a measure of, what can users expect to earn after they complete these different training programs? And if we have access to this historic wage data, we can calculate those ROI metrics. And so in order to do that, on the next slide, oh, actually, never mind. My bad. So actually, I didn't make another slide for this because the process is exactly the same as the previous one with the Department of Labor. The use and the goal have already been aligned because we want to provide information to residents of the state about the value of different training programs. And third-party application provider number 1 has already been approved to receive training provider and program data. So all that needs to be voted on is, can we calculate these new metrics, and can we share those metrics for specific use with this third-party application provider? And so that's just a few iterations of how this data governance board, over a series of 3 meetings, or this could even happen in 1 meeting, if they had all of their information in place, that it makes these, you could start with a very small goal and step by step have this group kind of navigate towards a shared goal of making as many data sets possible to meet this goal without creating an additional, technical burden to have to rebuild something over and over again. And we'll talk a little bit in a coming slide about what the technical side of this looks like.
Thanks, Matt. Yeah, so a lot of this is dependent on having the technology that allows that, really quick flip of a switch that's saying if a data trust governance board is allowing a new use of the data or a new user of the data, that those credentials and that access point can just be easily turned on. The third pillar of the BrightHive Data Trust framework is the technology side. It's what technically brings the data together to be combined, the outcomes to be calculated, and for data to be directed to an intended destination. Whether it's a cloud-hosted database, a series of APIs, whatever the solution is, it's operationalized last. It's not to say that there's not discussion along the way around, what is this going to look like, but we operationalize it last. It is captured in the data trust agreement through the collaborative conversations of the organizations that are contributing data. The reason that we are doing this last is because what we've learned is that we're otherwise taking a really huge risk in the success of the project of the data trust, because if the technical components of it are decided first before everyone is on board, it's akin to like a top-down mandate that identifies the solutions, but the organizations that it affects, the organizations that it impacts, they don't agree with it. It creates a lot of challenges, it creates a lot of resistance, and that takes a lot of time to overcome. So, organizations tend to experience as being told that they have to give up their system or they have to adopt something new, and that's not necessarily the case. And so what we do is try to understand what data are being shared, how does it need to come together, where does it need to go, and then we design the technical solution around it. The technical specifications, the privacy considerations, the anonymizing and de-identifying procedures, all of those are determined and discussed collaboratively in the data trust development agreement process. There's a lot of flexibility here to meet people and organizations where they are. I mean, we see things as sophisticated as, an organization creating a web service that allows us to pipe in to extract data. We also see, batch files that come through on a daily or weekly basis, depending upon how much that data is changing and the frequency. So we really do our best to work with the organizations and their preferences and their capabilities to for sharing that data. Here's an example of what the data trust looks like at a high level for the Virginia Workforce Data Trust. This is where agency data is coming into the trust through each agency's source system. BrightHive extracts the data from the source system in a way that the agency is signing off. Again, that's memorialized in the DTA. That data is standardized to the data trust data specifications and then made available through various API endpoints. Each API has a different subset of the data so that approved users of that subset only have access to what's been approved by the governance board. In this case in Virginia, they have 2 approved users, a dashboard analytics services company, and an application that Virginia residents are looking for WIOA, which is the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act. It's a federal program. So residents that are looking for those WIOA-funded workforce services use. If you Google My Virginia Journey, you can see what that application looks like. But data from the users of that application are sent back to the data trust and on to the agencies that provide those services. So this is people that are using that application, they're putting in their name, their contact information, their barriers. All of this information is what the agencies need to determine if someone's eligible for those workforce services. So when we talk about eliminating administrative burden, we're getting that information, entering it once and sending it across multiple agencies so that they don't have to also enter that information.
And then I just wanted to discuss just kind of one example. Not every data trust has to operate this way, but another benefit of one way that a data trust can be implemented technically is that the trust can create a secure location, a secure neutral location for data to be matched and consolidated outcomes to be calculated in such a way that none of the participating agencies have to see each other's data, which is often a barrier for data sharing in the first place. So in that example before, around calculating the return on investment for various training programs, you can have training program data that can be sent where each row represents one training program to that secured location. So for training program A, go back out to the training participant data and grab information about all the individuals who participated in a specific program. And just those participants will be pulled into the secure location. Then the wages for those participants and only those participants can be pulled in and the average wage calculated for those participants. And then, so you may have 100 rows of wages coming in, one average wage being calculated, and it's only that one row of program wage data that gets retained and made available in that API. All of the participant level data that was used to calculate it is deleted immediately. And it only existed in that secure data trust location that neither the higher education or the labor and employment agency had access to. So in this situation, it allows data sharing and calculation and new metrics to be calculated that previously through traditional data sharing would involve both of these agencies either sending their data to a trusted third-party data analyst or one agency sending their data to the other and trusting that the match was done right, was done correctly. It removes some of that risk and that vulnerability.
Okay, so just to sort of try to wrap things up here, what have we learned from our work to date? Obviously one of the biggest things that we've learned is developing tech requirements before governance is not ideal. It's putting too much of the cart before the horse. Governance really addresses the human problems in data sharing. It's really about bringing people together. There's an organization out there that says, data integration isn't just a technical problem, it's a human problem, and absolutely. And governance is putting the mechanism for bringing those humans together to make decisions about data. And that's actually where the value is. It's no longer just solving one data problem. I have this program that I need to understand outcomes for, or whatever my organization's sort of top level concern is, it's really about coming together to address something much broader. Matt mentioned shared goals in Virginia, for example. The shared goal is about improving economic opportunity for all Virginians. It's a pretty lofty goal, but there's a lot of different data initiatives, data sharing initiatives that can fit under that. And the governance process is what allows all of that data sharing to happen towards the realization of those goals. The other thing that BrightHive has learned is engagement is key. When we start to work on data trust, we really take a neutral third-party role. We have a customer, a paying customer, but they get no preferential treatment over the other organizations that we're trying to participate in the data trust because they're so essential to the use case. We engage with everybody. This helps establish buy-in. It helps establish ownership. It also starts establishing expectations. I mean, governance is a can be a time-consuming process. We're talking, meetings maybe once a month or once a quarter, depending upon how the governance board wants to do it. But it's really key for everyone to know sort of what's expected from them, not right at the start, but throughout the entire duration of the data trust. And since we want these things to be sustainable, I mean, we're talking potentially about years of engagement here. And so it's really critical for people to understand the commitment that they're making. But we often find that, people are really jazzed and really motivated by the problems that they're trying to solve and are willing to put the work in. Matt, anything you want to share about or anything further you want to share on that?
Yeah, I think I'll just reiterate what you said, in doing this work with BrightHive and working with some really great partners and customers, governance addresses a human problem in data sharing, but the humans are the solution there, right? There are great people and organizations everywhere who are working really hard to solve these problems. And we think that this framework, it doesn't make data sharing easy by any means. Data sharing is never easy, but it supports them and gives them a toolbox to work with so that the effort that they were putting into maybe just keeping the wheels turning on existing data sharing efforts can start to iteratively, make that data reusable and allow them to start to move forward and take that great expertise and on all the hard work that they were doing within their organization and across coalitions and really start to immediately see that progress towards those goals.
All righty, so we do want to open it up for questions and comments and feedback from those that are still with us. We have about 15 or so minutes left. I honestly did not think that we were going to go the full 90 minutes, so thank you to those that have hung on with us. But I do want to turn it over to those in the audience for their questions, and if there's anything in the chat, Matt, maybe you can share those out as well.
The only thing in the chat at this point, someone did share a link to those IATA standards that Jim mentioned earlier. So there's a great link to that for others who want to take a look at that. And I'll share a link both in the chat and in our Slack to the the data trust agreement that Natalie and I talked about earlier.
I'm going to just say, this is Jim Daniel, that I think BrightHive is like so cool what you're doing, and I'm just a huge supporter, and I really hope we figure out how to do this. So.
Well, thank you. We look forward to opportunities to working with many of you to help figure out ways that we might be able to help you all find solutions to your data sharing challenges. Looks like Christina Bass put two questions in the chat. First one is, how do you convene all of these organizations without it feeling like one group owns the project? And in your previous projects, who hosts the data? How does the third-party model work? So I'll tackle the first one. So one thing that we actually didn't get into within our discussion is that there are two roles within the Data Trust Governance Board. There are all of those Data Trust members who are those organizations who are contributing data to the trust, but then there's also a trustee who really, I guess, is the convener of the group. They facilitate. And oftentimes they come from an organization that may already be playing that role within the network. So for instance, we have a data trust with Goodwill Industries International, and they serve as the trustee for a data trust that consists of 10 local Goodwills regional Goodwills from across the country. And so GII serves in this trustee role, but the way that the trustee role is set up is that they actually don't have their own vote in matters. In fact, they really just represent the spirit of the trust. It's just their job to enact what all of the members propose and vote. So it creates the sense that it creates a clear guidance that one group is kind of steering the conversation, but the data trust agreement itself has very clear language as to the limits of their influence over that group.
The other thing I would add about the trustee role is, BrightHive tends to advise on who the trustee is, right? It's somebody that has legitimacy, someone that is positioned within the community. Like Matt was saying, sometimes that's clearer than not. And so, yeah, selecting the trustee can be a strategic decision, but it's also not permanent. The governance board can dismiss the trustee, they can replace the trustee. So you could also create a voting process or a democratic process where you have, a trustee that rotates every year among the different organizations that are part of the data trust. So, again, when you talk about the flexibility that the data trust agreement affords, putting in that process is certainly one of the things that you could do.
Yeah. And
Matt, what was the second question?
I was going to say that leads in really nicely to the second question, which was in your previous projects, who hosts the data and how does that third-party model work? So I think it does vary, like Natalie said, there's flexibility in how these can be deployed technically, and we really, help make recommendations based around what needs are identified by those groups. But so in some situations, it's the trustee that hosts the data. They have it, host it within their own servers. But again, because of the way that the data trust agreement defines their role, they are truly just hosting it and not owning it. They can only do things with it based on what the trust says. In other situations where it's allowable, BrightHive can help deploy a cloud-based location for the data trust to exist. And so in that instance, it's actually really convenient because the trust as an entity can own that cloud instance. It's not owned by BrightHive. Even if BrightHive helps set it up, it's actually registered to the trust itself. And so in that situation, there's a literal co-ownership of the data that exists there. Anything else you want to add to that one, Natalie?
No, I think you captured that well.
Okay. All right, we just had another question come in from Jessica. Do you ever run into issues with the data governance when they're setting up the data trust, but they don't include something that they later realize is needed?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So it just depends upon sort of the nature of what that is. Matt, I know that you have an experience the data trust agreement was signed and then almost immediately they realized that they didn't include something and then they had to add it and then they had to re-sign it. Matt talked about, there's different, the data trust agreement has what we call the body. So basically, this is the data trust and these are your member responsibilities and this is the trustee's responsibilities. And then there's exhibits to the data trust, and the exhibits to the data trust agreement can be modified at any time at the approval of the data trust governance board. That doesn't require a resignature of the the data trust agreement. But if you change the body of the data trust agreement, we generally advise for re-signatures. But it also is something that has to be voted on by everybody. So have we seen it? Yes. Is it smooth? Actually, surprisingly, it has been.
Yeah, because usually when this need for a change is identified, there's consensus around its importance. And so usually, even if it has to be re-signed, it could be pretty quick. I just pulled up the link to that data trust legal agreement, and I'm going to share that in the both the chat right now as well as the Slack channel. Any other questions?
One thing I mentioned is, or one thing we didn't mention, well, our presentation today mostly focused around workforce and the way that we're seeing higher education, labor data, wage data come together, especially in the WIOA context. That certainly is not the only area that BrightHive works in. We're also in social services. We're also in K through 12, childcare, as I mentioned, contact tracing, now that it is becoming part of the public health response to COVID. There are many different sectors and domains that BrightHive is experienced in. We just chose to focus on workforce, and so certainly don't want you to think that if you have a question in another sector that it's not relevant. We would, of course, love to hear from you.
Don't see any more questions at this time. If anybody has any last minute ones, I think participants are running down, so please feel free just to unmute yourself and ask. We'll hang around for a couple more minutes. There are other things people want to talk about, but if not, thank you all so much for coming today. We really appreciated your attendance and look forward to being in contact in the future.
Thanks everyone for joining. Really appreciate your time.